Hello, everyone. Welcome to our March edition of Fold Academy. My name is Hudson Lin. I am the program coordinator at the Fold, and I'm super excited today because we have the beloved Amanda Leduc with us, and she's going to be here to give us some insights into how to navigate the writing and publishing world as a disabled writer. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. This workshop will be approximately 1 hour long, and it'll include 15 to 20 minutes of question and answers at the end. If you have questions during the workshop, please submit it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Amanda has been really generous and she said that she will stay as long as there are questions. So even if we run over an hour, feel free to stick around as she answers all of your questions. We are using Zoom's auto captioning function. So please note that some of the captions might not be transcribed correctly, but all captions will be corrected when the recording is made available on YouTube. And yes, the recording will be made, there will be a recording made of today's webinar. It will be uploaded onto YouTube next week, and you will receive an email with a link to that video, as well as the PowerPoint that Amanda is sharing today. So I am super delighted to introduce Amanda Leduc. Amanda is a Canadian writer and disability rights advocate. She is the author of Disfigured: On Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space, which was shortlisted for the 2020 Governor General's Award in Nonfiction. She is also the author of the novels The Centaur's Wife and The Miracles of Ordinary Men. Her newest novel, Wildlife, will be published by, or has been published by Random House in spring 2025. It just came out recently. So welcome, Amanda, and take it away.
Hi, Lynn. Thank you so much for having me, guys. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all. As Lynn mentioned, I am happy to stay afterwards for as long as you guys have questions. So we might go a little over the hour. We'll see. The presentation that I have will probably take up about 40 minutes of the time. And as Lynn also mentioned, I do have slides that I will be sending out. So you guys will be able to get those slides afterwards. Before I started, I just wanted to go over a couple of points. Let me just bring them up. Can't depend on my memory these days. The first one is that I wanted to just acknowledge that I was really nervous when the Fold approached me and asked me if I wanted to do this workshop. And the reason for that is that I know that all of us as disabled people, our paths are all going to be very, very different. So some of the things that I talk about in my presentation might not be applicable to you. Some of the things might be applicable, but you might have to like tweak it a little bit to make it fit into your life. My hope is that what I've outlined here can help you to sort of start or continue to structure your path forward as a writer in the current landscape. So that's what my fingers are crossed. And the title of this presentation is Building a Life as a Disabled Writer, and that was intentional. There's a reason why I didn't call it Making a Living as a Disabled Writer, and we will get into that the farther along we go. I will say that a lot of the points that I talk about in the presentation are really more of like a general framework about how to exist in the world as a disabled artist, how to navigate that relationship between your needs as a disabled person and the art that you want to create. It's not as heavy on like the nuts and bolts of publishing and navigating the publishing system, although we absolutely can talk about that when it comes time for questions. Because there's also regional considerations. I'm sure that a lot of people are coming from different parts of the country, and so the resources and the access to resources that you'll have will be different in each province. And I am speaking from Ontario, so some of the things that I talk about are going to be a little Ontario-centric, but hopefully, again, you'll be able to take the principles that I talk about and apply to your own lives. The last thing that I wanted to say just before I get into my presentation is that my slides are a little bit text heavy. I've tried to make the text as large as I can for accessibility reasons. It's difficult for me to sort of glance at my notes and then look at the slides and move through them on Zoom at the same time. So that's why there's a lot of text, because I tend to read through the text and then like riff on that and talk about wider issues. So my apologies for that ahead of time. And yes, as Lynn mentioned, I will stay as long as necessary for questions. And now that all of that is out of the way, let's get to it. All right, so thank you again, everybody, for being here with me today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you, and hopefully some of this will be useful. So just a brief overview of the presentation. I'll have an author introduction at the beginning for anybody who might not be aware of me and my work. I'll talk a little bit about my own writing and disability journey over the last few decades. And then I'll go into some talking about the 4 resources that I think all disabled artists and writers need, and some thoughts on how we build them. And those 4 resources are financial resources, resources of time, resources of community, and resources of creative space. And I really want to stress right from the very beginning that this presentation and this talk isn't about garnering as many of those resources as you possibly can. It's about understanding what access you have to these resources in your own life and learning how to structure your life in such a way that you can thrive to the best of your ability through the use of these 4 resources in your life. And then before we go into questions, I think it's important to talk about how we also need to make space for and honor grief in our disabled lives, because that's a really big part of learning how to move through the messiness and the wonder of being a disabled person and a disabled artist and writer in the world. And then we will have questions at the end. So again, for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Amanda Leduc. I am a writer with cerebral palsy, a disabled author. I've been disabled my whole life, but it wasn't until my mid-30s that I really started to accept and acknowledge the specific role that disability had played in my life up to that point, and the role that it was continuing to play as I grew and changed as a person. I am the author of 4 books, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, Disfigured, On Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space, The Centaur's Wife, and Wildlife, which was just released about a week and a half ago. I've always wanted to be a writer. I've always had cerebral palsy, but it wasn't until my 30s, as I mentioned, that these 2 parts of myself really met. I obtained a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from the University of Victoria in 2006, and then a Master of Letters, an MLit, which is like an MFA, but it was a 1-year course, in creative writing from the University of St. Andrews in 2008. I incurred a lot of student loan debt to do that, which plays into what I will talk about a little bit later. When I graduated, I thought I would teach. That's sort of the role that a lot of creative writing majors are primed for. And then I graduated and discovered that I wasn't as fond of the classroom as I'd thought. I really like doing workshops and mentoring and all that sort of thing, but I wasn't as at home in the classroom environment as I thought I would be, which meant that I embarked on a different career when I stopped school. So after graduating from grad school in 2008, right when the recession hit, I embarked on a career in arts administration, which, as you can see, is basically just a really, really smart decision. Not, but smart for my heart. And because arts administration is what it is and doesn't pay a whole heck of a lot, I also embarked on a career of a Jill of all trades and basically did any odd jobs I could get to make money. I lived in Scotland from 2007 to 2010 and worked an average of 3 simultaneous part-time jobs during that time. I was always working, and I was always exhausted. My work days were usually like 14 to 15 hours long. I worked as an arts fundraiser. I worked as an admin assistant at a charity. I walked dogs for my neighbor on my lunch hour. I would run home on the bus and walk the dog along the beach and then go back to work. I worked as a proofreader for the university. And I also did temping as well. And I didn't realize it at the time, but a lot of my motivation to work, in addition to paying off my student loans, which, as I mentioned, I took out a lot of student loans to go away to school, A lot of my motivation actually came from a deep-seated belief that I wasn't good enough because of my disability and needed to constantly prove that I deserved to have a life worth living. I was just always tired because I was always working, but I felt like I was looking around and seeing everybody else around me who were sort of figuring it out, people who had jobs that allowed them things like dispendable or expendable income, disposable income, all these kinds of things. And I didn't, and I was like, well, I must be doing something wrong. I must not be working hard enough. And that was a theme that really carried through my 20s and into my early 30s. In 2010, I moved back to Canada and started a career in arts admin all over again. Once again, couldn't find full-time work and worked a variety of part-time jobs, some of them in arts admin, some of them in just regular admin, all while squeezing writing in wherever I could. I had a very small social life because I didn't have the time or the energy for anything else apart from work and writing. I didn't realize this at the time either, but I was actually prioritizing what was most important to me, which was writing, because it was a way for me to rest and also to rejuvenate. I didn't get the same sort of sense of rest from, for example, going out and being social or staying out late. Like that actually really exhausted me. But what did help was writing. When I lived in Scotland, there was a period of time when I was working 6 days a week, like 14-hour days, and Saturday was the only day that I had off. And I would wake up at like 9 a.m. and I would make myself tea and breakfast, and then I would sit on my couch and I would write for as long as I wanted. And even though that was work, there was something very restorative in it for me. So even then, even when I wasn't aware of it, I was starting to turn my life around and shape it around this thing that I really wanted to do. In 2016, so I'm back in Canada again by this point, I start working part-time for the Fold while continuing to work part-time at a hospital in Hamilton. I was making a little bit more money at this point, but not much because, of course, still part-time, still no benefits, still none of that. But I was able to save a little bit of money and go on a retreat at the Banff Center in the summer for 2 weeks to focus on my writing. I will acknowledge right here and again a little bit later in the presentation that, there's a lot of privilege inherent in that. The fact that I was able to save money to go to the Banff Center at all, the fact that I had some flexibility with my jobs to be able to finagle 2 weeks of time to go away and do my writing, huge privilege. But it was also a really big and significant decision for me because I kept telling myself before I went away that I could just as easily write at home. It would save me more money, it would be easier. But the thing was that I wasn't doing as much writing at home because I was so tired. So the decision to actively give my writing time and space was really revolutionary for me and would continue to guide and shape my life in the years that followed. It is the same kind of decision that I made when I was in Scotland and I was choosing to spend that Saturday doing nothing but writing, because there was something about writing that just made things feel better for me, at least at that point in time, even if I was having to finagle a lot of different things and do a lot of juggling of different parts of my life in order to make that happen. The decision to actively invest in 2016 what limited financial resources I had at the time in prioritizing writing mirrored another investment that was starting to happen in my life regarding disability, which was that I began to actively invest in rest. And for me, what actively investing in rest looked like was I actually actively started to peel away non-essential things in my life that were jostling for the space that I could give to rest and creation. The largest part of that was a social life. And again, I know that this is not something that, is the same for everybody. A lot of people find a lot of rejuvenation and a lot of strength in social activities and being around other people. And I don't mean to downplay that in any way. I just want to talk about what was working for me. And the point was that I saw and recognized on some level what was helping me feel like the fullest version of myself and the things that were pulling away from that. And I was deciding to start letting go of the things that were pulling away. I was starting to really truly acknowledge that my writing deserved time and energy at the same time that I was acknowledging that my disability, such as it was going to make my life take a different shape. I have a lot of able-bodied privilege, even with my disability, but one of the main ways that cerebral palsy acts in my life is fatigue. Like, I am tired all the time. I'm notorious among my friends for like, okay, Leduc is going to bed between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. This is the exciting life that I lead. And really what started happening in my mid-30s was that I came to a space of real awareness of that and just acknowledgement of it, and really started to embrace that. In 2022, after 6 years of working at the Fold, I started to feel a really kind of insistent pull away from my full-time job to a more freelance-centered life. And that has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the Fold. They are the best organization ever. And, it's the best job that I ever had, really, was working at the Fold, apart from writing, which is what I'm doing now. And I just got to a point where I felt like I couldn't do both of those things. I couldn't focus full-time on the Fold and also give the same kinds of resources to my writing. And I was single, I still am, I don't have any dependents. I was at a place in my life where I could sort of start seeing how I might be able to use the resources that I had to reach for that freelance life that I wanted, because the opportunity was available to me at that point in time. It very well may be different 5 years in the future, next year, who knows? And again, I'll get into that a little bit later on. So in 2022, I began to feel this pull away from full-time job to a more freelance-centered life. And I looked to see how I might be able to make that happen. And I was initially just thinking about a leave of absence because I had a project, several projects that I wanted to work on. And so what I did was I applied for a number of grants, and I managed to get enough money to take a year's leave of absence from the Fold to focus on these new projects. As that year came to a close, I decided to embark on a full-time freelance career. During this process, which was heightened during my leave of absence, but it had really started years earlier when I had made that decision to go to Banff, when I had really started to think about how my life was shaping itself around my writing and this kind of creative output that I wanted. I began to shift more energy into cultivating 4 different kinds of resources in my life. And those resources are financial resources, resources of time, resources of community. And then once I have all those 3, I'm sort of working those all together, I found that it really opened up a 4th resource, which I call creative space. The first one is financial resources. And of course, I will talk about, day jobs and all that in a little bit. But one of the main ways that I have found, one of the main things I found really helpful as a disabled writer is the prevalence of grants in Canada. So in addition to regular grants, we do have several kinds of granting streams in this country that are specifically available for disabled writers. So some programs available in Canada are, and again, apologies for being Ontario-centric here, or slightly Ontario-centric. The Ontario Arts Council has a Deaf and Disability Arts Grant. The BC Arts Council, according to the research that I did on their website, they have a Deaf, Disability, and Mad Arts stream. The Canada Council, which is federal, has a Deaf and Disability Arts grant stream as well. This is part of the Explore and Create granting program. So in the Ontario Arts Council, there is the Deaf and Disability Arts Grant. This is an annual deadline. It's usually in September or October. Grants are $10,000 for a written work or a performance piece. You must self-identify as a disabled artist in order to apply. You also have to meet granting criteria. So if you are familiar with the Ontario Arts Council system already, you'll know that you need to have a certain number of published works in order to qualify to apply to this granting program. All of these criteria are outlined on the OAC website. The application is also done online through the Ontario Arts Council granting portal, which is called NOVA. And I do have links to all of this at the end of the presentation. The Ontario Arts Council also has a number of other granting programs which aren't specifically about disability. There are the Literary Creations Projects Grant. This is an annual deadline that's usually in September. It's $12,000 for a written work. There's a separate grant stream, which is literary creations for works for performance works, so spoken word poetry, things like that. There's also the Recommenders program. This is a program where applications are accepted between September and January in a given year. You can apply to a maximum of 10 recommenders. So what this program is it has various publishers in Ontario who will go through applications and recommend those applications for funding. Publishers can recommend between $1,500 to $5,000 for a project, and you can apply up to 10 recommendations, or apply up to 10 recommenders. Grants can theoretically, therefore, go up to $50,000 if you get the maximum of $5,000 from all 10 recommenders who recommend your project. Chances are it's going to be much, much less than that. Recommenders, in my experience, usually recommend around $1,500 to $2,000 per project, and that way they can spread out the money that they have to a bunch of different recipients. I mentioned the literary creations and the recommender streams, even though they don't specifically deal with disability, because you can apply to all of these streams at once with different projects to increase your odds of getting money. So say you have a novel, you can apply to the recommenders and the literary creations stream at the same time for that novel. You can also, if you have a collection of poetry that you're working on at the same time, apply to the Deaf and Disability Arts stream in the same year for the September deadline for that collection of poetry. It just has to be a different project. So you couldn't apply to recommenders and literary creations and Deaf and Disability Arts in the same year for that novel. This is just important to know and think about, because part of garnering financial resources is really trying to understand what is available to you and how much of it you can apply for. All of these things, obviously, these granting programs are really competitive. So, you know, I think my outlook on it is always to cast as wide a net as you possibly can, because chances are you're not going to get all the grants that you apply for. But if you apply for more, the chances are higher that you will get more money. The Canada Council for the Arts has a separate Deaf and Disability Arts stream. It is part of the Explore and Create program. To apply for the Deaf and Disability Arts stream, you must be registered in the Canada Council funding portal as a deaf and disabled artist. So for many people, you're probably already registered in the Canada Council portal as a literary writer. You can also create a separate profile as a deaf and disabled artist. You can have two profiles at once. The Deaf and Disability Arts stream has two components. The first is a project grant component. This awards a maximum of $25,000 per year for 2 years for a maximum of $50,000 in total. They also have a composite grant stream. You get a maximum of $60,000 per year or $100,000 per year for large-scale projects for a period of 3 years. In order to qualify for a composite grant, you must have been awarded 2 project grants within the last 5 years. Important to remember, composite grants must have some element of presentation in them. Disabled writers who are working on literary projects without some performance, so spoken word, a visual art collaboration, a podcast, they're not eligible. You cannot apply to the composite grant program if you are working on a novel or 2 novels and you're going to travel around the country and promote your novel in bookstores. That does not apply in this program. I know we can collectively roll our eyes at this and wonder why. I'm not sure why. I have spoken to the Deaf and Disability Arts Officer at the Canada Council about exactly this, and nobody really has an answer. But the way that you work with this is you have to think about some element of performance that could be a part of a project that you want to do. So for example, I have received 2 project grants from the Canada Council within the last 5 years. And so I have applied to the composite program this year under my disabled artist profile for a 3-year literary project that involves traveling to promote and read my work, performance elements in community that involve group travel, group activities, And then the creation of a podcast. If the project was just about traveling and promoting my work, it would not be eligible. Sorry. So I really had to think about how I could not just promote my work and write it, but also perform it in very particular ways. As a disabled writer, you can apply to the Deaf and Disability Arts stream and the literary writer streams at the Canada Council with the same project, but you can only accept one of the grants if you are awarded both. Also important, if you are in Ontario and you are on ODSP, you can still apply for arts grants. They don't count towards your annual income for ODSP purposes, even though you do have to pay taxes on the grants themselves. There are some more finicky rules, of course there are, about this particular thing. You can't apply for arts grants that are covering like an artist fee, so money that you would pay yourself in order to write. You would have to factor in, what am I trying to say? If you apply for money for an arts grant that pays you a fee to write, that actually does get counted towards your income for ODSP purposes. So if you are on ODSP and you are applying for an arts grant, it has to be an arts grant that would cover projects that are, or elements of your project that are like research costs or travel for your project or research materials or arts materials, that sort of thing. It's unfortunate, and you know, I have sat on disability juries before and I have argued against this because people make these grants and I feel like I look at them and I'm like, they're not paying themselves enough. And the reason for that is that a lot of these artists are on ODSP and have to factor in making sure that the money that they get for their grants doesn't count against the ODSP income. So it's finicky, but you can do it. You just have to think about how you apply for that grant and you make that grant go towards elements of your project that are not paying you to complete the project itself. BC Arts Council and other arts councils, the BC Arts Council has a Deaf, Disability and Mad Arts stream. So if you're watching this from BC, I encourage you to research the BC Arts Council. Other provincial resources, I do have a link to the Saskatchewan Arts Board, which administers, among others, the Access Copyright Events Grants, which are federal, the Access Copyright Marion Heb Research Grant as well, which allows you to cover research costs, so going on a trip somewhere to undertake research for a particular project, that's a federal program as well. And I don't think I have a, no, I do, sorry. I do have a link to the Saskatchewan Arts Board, so you can find out information about all of that. And I really encourage you to conduct your own search to determine if your province has a granting program that highlights disability in some way. Other financial resources that, you know, I think are always really important, obviously day jobs. Hardly anybody is making a living from writing these days. I am currently working as a freelance writer, but, and I will get into this, it's very precarious. And, you know, the only reason that I am able to do that right now is because I am only paying living costs for myself. If I had any dependents, I would not be able to do this. So I really, you know, day jobs are really, really important in terms of making sure that you have that peace of mind in terms of financial resources coming in. There are also fellowships that as writers we can apply for. Things like the Whiting Foundation, the Silvers Foundation, Guggenheim Fellowships. Many of these are based in the US, but they also allow Canadians to apply. So I would highly recommend that you look for those. Municipal grants, right? So city-based arts councils, the Hamilton Arts Council has in the past had grants that they gave out to writers. Brampton, where the Fold is based, just instituted a writer in residence program. It's a municipal program put on through the city. So these are all things that are available on a smaller scale, and I really encourage, again, everyone to, you know, look at these and really try and think about how and where you might be able to finagle some of this into your own life. Residencies. Many libraries and universities offer writer or artist in residence programs, and many municipalities, such like Brampton, do as well. Sometimes residencies don't necessarily translate into a lot of money, but they can translate into the resource of time. That is our second resource. Time is a valuable thing for a writer or indeed for any artist. Often we focus on acquiring money precisely so that we can get time to focus on our art. This is why financial resources can be so useful. But sometimes finding time for our art can also mean giving things up in order to leave space for art making. Building resources of time means learning how to be creative and intentional about the resources that you have at your disposal. Example, as I began to feel my artistic and disabled lives intertwine in my 30s, I started to recognize that lower energy could in fact be a blessing if I wanted to see it that way, because I didn't have any space anymore for things that weren't important to me. I no longer had to make excuses for doing things I didn't want to do. I simply acknowledged that I needed to rest in order to be my best self. Lots of things fell away as a result of this: a larger social life, more professional opportunities, but in their wake, more time opened up for me to create and rest and be. We aren't used to thinking about this as a win because we are taught in our capitalist system that we must want to have it all in order to be happy. Not just have it all, but you have to want to have it all. Because if you don't want to have it all, then you're not ambitious enough, or you're not doing what you need to do in the world, all these kinds of things. Turning away from the having it all and expecting that you'll have it all, expectation, wanting to have it all, can be really freeing and can open up a lot. But this can also come with a lot of grief, which we will explore in a little bit. So when I think about time, I think about, obviously how much time am I able to spend writing? But more importantly, I think, what is the quality of that time? Does my creative time energize me, even if it isn't as much time as I would like? Does it make me happy? Do I look forward to it? If I want more writing time, what do I have to do or give up or explore in order to make that a reality, right? And this is actually something that I would argue that most artists have to deal with, not just disabled artists. If you're, for example, someone who's an artist and you also have dependents, you also have kids, you have to make a choice at times. I'm going to spend time on my art versus, someone else is going to take the kids to swimming. I am going to forego an extra half hour of sleep in the morning so that I can spend time with my art, right? An artistic life is made of choices, and these are choices that we are all making along the way. The third resource, which ties into time, which ties into finances. As disabled writers and artists, we know that community is crucial. Community comes in many forms. It comes online, it comes offline, it comes in art spaces and outside of them. It comes through family, it comes through chosen family, it comes through interactions with your neighbors. A single interaction with someone can be community. It doesn't have to be a lot or to happen often. Like time, what matters is quality. Our ability to participate in community, much like our abilities to make money and allocate time, also ebb and flow. And this is really, really important. No one is ever at 100% all of the time. When I think back over my life, and it's certainly when I moved back to Hamilton, which was 15 years ago, I spent a large part of, I'd say, the first 7 years of my time in the city trying to build community. I put a lot more resources into, starting a reading series, into attending literary events, into meeting people in the city, into, making friends with bookstore owners because I love book people, all that sort of thing. And the last few years, certainly the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years, I've really eased off on a lot of that community stuff because I needed time to focus on my writing. I just needed to cocoon and, focus on my work, and I didn't have as much energy to put into community-based things. That's fine because I put energy into community stuff beforehand, and I will most likely be putting energy into community things again in the future. It doesn't all have to happen at the same time. And that's really, really important. It's something that I keep reminding myself of. What do you like about community in your art form? How can you participate in that community to the best of your ability? Maybe you're joining an online writing group. Maybe you finagle an in-person writing group or an in-person writing hangout in your community, in your town, wherever you are. Also ask yourself, what grace can you give yourself if and when you're not able to do all that you want for or in your community? This is really important too, right? I think, again, that sort of insistent voice that says we have to have it all also says we have to do it all the time. And that is not workable. If being in community drains you, or if you get to a point where all of the community stuff that you have done has just burned you out, you're of no help to anybody, least of all, and most importantly, yourself. And so you have to be thinking about those things, right? Like, how does community create and nurture space for your disabled self, artistically, emotionally, mentally? These are questions that I think we are always in relationship with, and the answers to those questions will shift and change as our disabilities change, as we change as individuals. Building any kind of creative life, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is about choices. And as disabled writers and artists, we generally have less choice than most because our bodies often make the choices for us. And this means that we have to try and be creative, but also really compassionate with ourselves in making the choices that we do. Sometimes we don't get to choose community and creating at the same time. Sometimes it's one or the other, and that's okay. Remember, everything ebbs and flows. This might seem like not a silly, but like a trivial example. But, as I mentioned before, like the reason that I'm able to be a writer, freelance writer, full-time writer right now, is that I don't have any dependents, right? And like that was a real struggle for me for a long time. I really wanted a family. I wanted to have that life. But I think even as I say that, I was making choices all the way along that meant that having a life that is focused around my art was always kind of the direction that I was heading, because I was prioritizing that. And it doesn't mean that that doesn't come with grief, right? Like my life looks very different than how I thought it would look when I was in my 20s. I try hard to be really compassionate with myself when I think about the choices that I've made that have led me to this point right now. There's a lot of freedom in the life that I have, and there's also a lot of things that still hurt a little bit, but that's okay. Like, it's okay to exist in that space. The fourth resource that I have found to really be workable in my own life is the resource of creative space. Creative space is tied to all of the resources that we've already talked about. It comes from being able to creatively and compassionately work with the financial, time, and community resources that we have in our lives. It doesn't need a surplus of the above things to come into being. I'm not saying that, once you get to 25% financial and 25% time and 25% community, the other 25% will fall into place with creative space. Sometimes creative space can arise out of a lack of any of the other three resources, because it forces you to be creative and really think about how to structure your life differently. Sometimes a lack of finances, for example, forces us to be creative. We trade, we barter, we use community, we get together with a group of friends and decide to start a reading series, and the things come from there. Sometimes a lack of time forces us to be really intentional about the time that we do have, like when I was in Scotland and working those days on the Saturdays when I would do nothing but write. That came from a lack of time. Sometimes the lack of community primes us to be really mindful of and appreciative of community when it appears. All of these lacks, or so-called lacks, can open up a space of and for creativity in our art, but also in our lives. A life that is rich in creative space is one where we allow wonder to move through us on a daily basis, where we see art and the beginnings of art everywhere. And like that doesn't have to mean that you go away to Banff, right? If you are rich in creative space and you're allowing that sort of wonder to move through you, the 10 minutes that you spend walking to the bus in the morning can be a really generative, rich, fruitful time, right? The interactions that you have with somebody can be a really generative space to think about your work. Learning how to balance and move through all of these resources, and recognizing that that balance and moving through will always shift and change as you as a person shifts and change, It helps us to open into a space of understanding what is in our lives. It helps us to move into a space of understanding the shape of our particular lives. What is the shape of our lives as artists? What makes us happy? What gives us rest? And those questions are going to be different for everybody. The answers for everyone are going to be different as well. Making room for creative space in our lives is not about creating art to sell. Again, the webinar is called Building a Life as a Disabled Artist. It is not called Making a Living as a Disabled Artist. Nothing about any of the resources that I've talked about is meant to equate with or make publishing or arts presentation foolproof, even though these are all resources and opportunities for us to work towards this goal if this is what we want. If you want to, publish your work and exist in community with other disabled writers, there are lots of things that you can do in terms of community, in terms of, thinking about financial resources that are available, in terms of thinking about resources that are available in terms of time that will help you on that goal to publishing, to being a part of the published writer community. But it's not the be all and end all. Learning how to build a life as a disabled writer and artist is also about learning how to build a life that honors who we are as people. It can definitely be about making art and publishing work and disseminating your art out into the world, but it's not dependent on these things. The key here is that building a life as a disabled writer and artist is not linked to how much art you create or how much art you sell, if you even sell any. Instead, it is about learning how to weave that sense of creative space throughout your life so that you have time for rest and creation. This can happen with or without selling your art and your words. Case study, and I've alluded to this at several points over the presentation. I currently work full-time as a writer. This means that I spend about 25% of my time doing life admin, 25% of my time applying for grants and looking for other ways to make money, 25% of my time mentoring and talking about writing, which makes me money, and 25% of my time actually writing, right? So of this great, wonderful freelance life that I have, only a quarter of it is actually spent on writing. The difference for me is that when I was working full-time, I had 60% of my time spent on my full-time job, and then 40% of my time spent on doing all of these other things that I've mentioned here. So previously, I was spending like 10% of my time writing. So now, even though I'm maybe a quarter of my time, 25% of my time is spent writing, it feels like I get twice the amount of time that I had before, which is really, really valuable to that sense of creative space in my own life. It's definitely not the blissful hours at my desk creative space I once envisioned a life as a writer would be, but without a sort of externally designed and externally imposed schedule and no work priorities apart from the ones that I choose, I have a lot of time to rest and follow my own creative priorities and be in wonder at the world. It's a huge boon for my creative self. It really rejuvenates me on a daily basis. As I said, there's a lot of privilege that makes this possible. I don't have any dependents. I am currently in relatively good health, and I have manageable home costs, although this could always change. If I lost my apartment in Hamilton right now, I would not be able to afford to stay in the city. I would have to move and go elsewhere. But given all this, at the same time, it's also really, really precarious, right? There's a certain amount of precarity that exists alongside the privilege, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that too. I don't know where any of my money is coming from once this year is up. That's it. I have money in my account right now and it just keeps going down and it doesn't really replenish at all. I have no savings and no pension to speak of. My retirement plan, I was laughing about this with Lynn just before this started today. My retirement plan is to work until I'm dead, which absolutely is precarious and also in a weird way a kind of privilege because I recognize that a lot of disabled people don't have that option, right? My social life is extraordinarily tiny. I have one lunch date where I see a friend every couple of weeks, and that is pretty much it. Occasionally I will go out to book stuff, but usually it's just me snuggling with the dog on the couch and writing and doing my work and getting groceries. That is my life, basically. And I can't afford, either financially or energy-wise, for it to be any bigger. Also, most importantly, all of this could change at any given moment. If anything happens to my health, I might have to find an old-fashioned job with benefits again. Who knows in this current day and age if any of this could be possible. There's also a very real possibility that I might have to step into a caregiving role in the next couple of years and move home with my parents. That will completely change my life and change how it orients. And so, that's also a possibility that I keep in my head, but I keep it in my head in terms of the resources that I've talked about, right? If those circumstances change for me in that way, I will be thinking about how I can utilize the resources that I've already built in my own life to get myself into a creative space again, given those changing circumstances. Ultimately, I decided to make the choice that I did right now and write full-time. Sorry, I know I keep quoting, but I find it so funny, right? This is the dream that we all work towards, writing full-time, and it's like the farthest thing from full-time. I had recognized at the time that my life no longer had the shape that I'd envisioned for it, right? I didn't have dependents, I didn't have a family, so I had a lot of freedom, even though I had to give up a lot of things and make a lot of choices along the way, some of it intentionally and some of it not, in order to chase that creative life. I decided to make this decision because it was like, well, if I don't do it now, when am I going to do it, right? And it's very possible that this is not a permanent part of my life, right? Like, I will probably go back to having a regular job at some point when, the need for benefits and physiotherapy becomes really something I can't ignore. I'm currently ignoring it right now because I can, but that, again, as with many things, could change for me in the future. My story will obviously look different from yours depending on what resources you may or may not have access to, but even so, something we still have in common is making space for grief. As disabled writers and artists, we often have fewer choices than other people. This is especially true when we factor in limited energy levels and all of the stuff that needs doing in order to keep our disabled lives afloat. There's also lots of stuff that needs doing in order to keep our artistic lives afloat, right? And we don't always have space to hold all of that at the same time. Usually this means as disabled writers and artists, we can't have it all, certainly not all at the same time, and sometimes not even in general. It's normal and healthy to feel grief about this reality. And it's normal for that grief, as with many other things that I've been talking about, to ebb and to flow. One day you might be okay with the reality that you currently find yourself in, and another day you might not. One of the things I struggle with in narratives around disability, particularly over the last 5-10 years, has been this focus on disability pride. I think it's really important and really necessary, but sometimes I feel like it is talked about in ways that make it feel like we must have disabled pride and to the exclusion of all else. And I think we can feel pride for and in our disabled bodies and lives, but we can also make room to grieve the lives that we will not have, the bodies that we will not have, and the opportunities that we won't get due to systemic barriers that are in place. There are many professional opportunities that disabled writers do not and will not get due to ableism, and we can and should grieve this. This is a particular kind of grief because it is a reaction against an unfair system, and it is incredibly difficult to change systems, never mind as someone with limited energy. I've struggled with a lot of rage and grief over this ableism in literary spaces in particular over the last few years. Ultimately, I've had to acknowledge my grief and accept that I have to exist alongside it because the changes that I want to see are not going to happen in my lifetime. One way of living with this grief is by letting any expectations I have about my career and artistic life and letting go of all of that and learning to really sit with, look at, and be curious about the life that I do have. Another way of living with this grief is by bringing the 4 resources that I've been talking about to my work as a disability rights activist, particularly in the CanLit space. I can't fix everything, but what power do I have in my small circle of influence, my small circle of space? I can, for example, advocate for wheelchair accessible literary spaces by refusing to appear in places that are not wheelchair accessible. That's one way that I can wield some small kernel of financial power. I can ensure that I plan a schedule for myself that gives me lots of time to meet with people and leaves me and them rested after our interactions. This is me wielding my power of time, my resource of time. I can advocate for both in-person and online events. I am in this instance wielding community power, wielding that community resource to the best of my ability. I can advocate for new ways of doing and being in CanLit that respect different schedules and capacities, thinking about that element of creative space and leaving room for it to flourish in whatever ways it needs to. I do not and cannot, and neither can any of us, do any of these things perfectly, right? If we were to do it perfectly, if I was to do it perfectly, I would say I am not going to appear at any literary events unless they are wheelchair accessible, unless there's a wheelchair accessible washroom, unless there is a support person for anybody with a disability who wants to come, unless everybody has pamphlets for the information, unless it's a scent-free environment, unless there is ASL and captions. Like, the list goes on and on and on and on and on, right? It is impossible to have a fully accessible event. And it is not always on our shoulders, or it shouldn't be on our shoulders as disabled artists and writers, to ensure that all of these things are in place. It's actually something that's the responsibility of the arts organizers, the event organizers that are putting on all of these events. And it's really hard to do all of these things at the same time. There are financial constraints, there are resource constraints all along the line, but we can work towards always increasing our accessibility, right? So talking about these things and being aware of the ways in which we can all do better is one of those ways in which we move toward that slightly better world. Putting all of these things to play in various ways throughout my work, regardless of if I'm doing it all at the same time or doing a little bit here and there whenever I can, whenever I have the capacity and the resources available to do so, this helps me to grapple with the grief I feel at our imperfect world and my place in it. It's an imperfect world, but I am doing what I can. And that is what I can ask of everybody else, right? That we do what we can when we are able to do so. As my life and disability continues to change, the grief that I have and the relationship with grief will also grow and change, right? It ebbs and flows just like our energy as disabled people. I am trying to honor that as a way of making creative space for the grief as well, because I think, one of the ways that we deal with grief is by getting creative and thinking about ways to not overcome our sadness, but existing with it and looking at the way that grief can make us see certain things in different ways, in different lights. Learning how to acknowledge and leave space for grief to accept the, there we go, yes. Leave space for grief to accept our lives as they are while also continuing to advocate for change. Even tiny change in what ways we can is a huge part of allowing that creative space to flourish. I don't mean to say that we should accept systems of oppression. I merely want to note that grief is a healthy reaction and we spend a lot of time being afraid of it. But there's a richness that can be found in it if we take the time to look at it and see how it operates in our lives. To recap, building a life as a disabled writer and artist is about learning how to be creative and intentional about the choices we have to make in our artistic lives. We can create a framework for that choice making by building up and moving between 4 different kinds of resources: financial, time, community, and creative space. Shoring up these resources allows us to interact with the grief we continually encounter as disabled people, writers, and artists, and allows us to operate with peace, wonder, and curiosity. So this is a list of resources. I am a bit flustered because I've realized how much longer my presentation has gone, and I do apologize for that, guys. This is a list of resources here. The links do all work, so when Lynn hands out the slides, you should be able to access all of this. And now we will open it up to Q&A. Again, I apologize for going over time. I'm really sorry, everybody. I see there's lots of questions in the Q&A, so we can get to that. And I hope you have found this useful. Yes, moving forward.
Okay, so a lot of folks have been providing a lot of really good resources. So I've been throwing them into the chat as people have been sending them in. I also want to mention that a couple of people have just said some like very affirmative things from your presentation. So I think Lenny said that the point about worth, this was at the beginning of your presentation, really resonated. I've been trying to dismantle that idea lately, and I resonate with that as well. I think a lot of us struggle with that a lot. um, and then Haley says, thank you so much for naming that dependence, disability, and choosing your art and the grief around that. I'm turning 35 this summer and contemplating this is a lot. Heart solidarity. So just want to mention those two things. If you have questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. If you would rather answer them verbally, raise your hand and we'll get to you as well. I'll turn your mic off and then you can answer. You can ask your question verbally. First question comes from Trudy. I'm 74. What grants can I get as a senior to spend time writing?
That's a great question, Trudy. Um, so the Ontario Arts Council grants and the Canada Arts Council grants, I mean, there's no age limit on those. So, the I don't know if you're based in Ontario, Trudy. Certainly the Canada Arts Council grants, Canada Council for the Arts, sorry, I always get that mixed up. There is no age limit on those. The issue, though, is that you do need to have a certain amount of publications, and that would be like publishing a short story in a literary journal. So I would encourage you to look at the Canada Arts Council. Again, if you are, depending on where you are, if you're in a city, look at your city and if they have an arts council, and if the arts council has different grants that they give out. A lot of times they're quite small. They might only be like $500 or $1,000. But I mean, that, is money that can pay for a number of weekends where you spend time writing and you know that you have money that covers that amount. So I would check on the municipal level. I would look at the Canada Arts Council and see what you have to do in order to create a profile for yourself and what you can do to build up publication credits to qualify for creating a profile for yourself. And then if you're in Ontario, the same applies. Like, go to the Ontario Arts Council website, look at what qualifications you need to have. And then if you need to get those publications in order to qualify, start thinking about sending your work out, short stories, poetry, that sort of thing. Because as soon as you get those publications, then that opens the door to getting more granting money.
Great. Okay, let's do a verbal question from Lisa. Lisa, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just had a question. I'm a poet. I'm also queer. I'm also disabled. I'm also poor. I'm also, a bunch of ways that I'm marginalized. And I often wonder how to identify myself. I've been sending out my work and I'm working on a manuscript. And I'm wondering I guess now you've written enough novels that you don't do that, but do you always identify as disabled? Is that your first thing? Like, I've been wondering how much of these things do I mention when a lot of places now are wanting things to be more diverse and they want you to self-identify, but I often wonder, sometimes I'm afraid if I identify as this, will they overlook my work and just think of me as a sick person?
Well, I mean, I think one of the answers there if you're applying to someone or if you're submitting to someone and they overlook the quality of your work purely on the basis of the identifiers, then that's not really a publication that you want to be associated with anyway.
Right.
I think there is, financial reasons for why, in addition to social reasons, a lot of the financial reasons for why publishers ask for people is because disability, along with queerness, they're marginalized groups, and publishers do have extra funds that they have received in order to make sure that they are catering to and creating space for those groups. So I always recommend that people, if you feel comfortable identifying yourself with however many identifiers you like, then use them all.
Okay.
Because you will find a publisher eventually and someone who will connect with your work and then will also be in a space to really give your work the kind of nurturing that it deserves and the ability to connect with other communities, right?
Right.
marginalized communities that really help your work to flourish and thrive. So when I say this to people, I really do mean it. Like, don't be afraid to identify yourself
Okay.
this way. I will always identify myself as a disabled writer.
Mhm.
Um, it's a, as much as I've talked about pride, I
Mhm.
know, but it is a point of pride for me. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, well, maybe you'll give me the courage to do this.
I hope so. I'm crossing my fingers.
Uh, Thanks. Thank you. I
Thanks so
enjoyed
much,
your
Lisa.
talk. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, let's go back to the Q&A box. Another question, can you say more about the CAA, or sorry, CCA, Deaf and Disabled Arts Stream? I've emailed with the CCA about grants specifically for disabled artists, and they were very evasive and vague in their answers.
Mhm. Yeah, so the Deaf and Disability Arts stream is a stream of money. It's a prioritized stream of money that's specifically for art that deals with disability, and that's art that's created by disabled artists. A lot of times, the art itself has some element of disability narrative in it, in some way. So I have sat on the jury panel for this, or the assessment panel rather, for this art stream a number of times. So people will, give projects that, for example, look at alt text, so alternative text with pictures, and how that can become an art form in and of itself, right? We have given money to disabled poets who are working on manuscripts. We have given money to disabled textile artists who are using their textile art form to look at and grapple with disability in some way. It's really wide open. The issue with the Deaf and Disability Art stream is that it's open to all artists with a disability. So you're not just competing, I hate competing, that's a terrible word, but when you apply to that stream, you are not just having your work assessed against the work of other writers, you're having the work assessed against the work of other disabled artists who might be working in an entirely different art form. I do know that the Deaf and Disability Arts stream, they have really been thinking about how they can get more word about their stream out. And I am hoping to talk to the Deaf and Disability Arts officer about having another information session about that stream. So fingers crossed that will be coming along at some point. But really, the idea is that if you are a disabled writer, you are eligible for that stream. It's just a matter of thinking about how you position your work as dealing with and factoring in looking at disability in some way.
Great. Okay, let's do another verbal one from Mark. Mark, whenever you're ready.
Hello.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. First of all, I want to say it's good to see you again. I thought in the like overhead picture you looked familiar, and then I'm like, wait, I met her at NISA when
Hey, back.
when your fairy tale book came out and stuff. And by the way, I bought that and read that. Thank you.
Thank you for reading.
And I don't know if you knew this, but for anybody that didn't know, that book at least was accessible with my assistive device. Like I could just ask it to read it, and it did. So whoever put it up there for you made it accessible in that way.
They did. Yes, Coach House did a wonderful job with that book.
Yeah. So I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for talking about grief, because I feel like a lot of people misunderstand me when I say I'm trying to think outside the box, because you brought up a lot of good points about, like, we don't make money from the, like, we're not writers to be millionaires, right? And so I was trying to connect with a local writers guild, and I said in the past, you guys have misunderstood some stuff, or I misunderstood some stuff, and I need to be clear about your rules. And they told me, and then I was having a day where I was talking about the blues of like wondering about, is this all worth it? Like, I've thought about outside the box about raising money this way and that way. And instantly I got accused of asking people for money. I was just like, no, I was talking about potential outside the ways to do it. Like, and I feel isolated from the artistic community on some point because I also, as I have been self-published, but I've taken down the work because I received a lot of hate that had nothing to do with the work,
Mhm.
and the media uh didn't take me seriously because I'm sure you can relate to, because I'm not the disability hero or a Rick Hansen, and I've made some mistakes due to mental health challenges. I'm not the hero advocate, the hero writer. And I'm just wondering, how do you navigate, like, how might somebody that's on ODSP and have a learning disability, uh how might we what's some outside the box ways to navigate people that don't get it,
Mhm.
or to maybe get um noticed outside the traditional realms, because again, media might not want to look at you because you have a lived experience in the criminal justice system due to mental health challenges. uh and I hope I didn't ramble, but yeah, thank you very much for your book. And actually, my last question, what is this organization itself? Because I was curious, because I've never heard of it before until I got the ticket shared to me by a peer. Uh, and I also shared a link to a legal clinic in Northern Ontario for artists that may not be able to go to an entertainment lawyer, published lawyer, copyright lawyer. It's in the chat. Anyway, it's called The Last. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Those are some great series of questions. I'll let Lynn answer the question about Fold. Just I'll speak to the disability grief and disability space. I mean, I think the reality is, and this again is where, yes, the grief comes in. A lot of people, because we live in a society that really does not acknowledge what it means to be disabled in the world, to be different from the society that has been constructed for us. Because we live in that society, a lot of people won't get the work. And I mean, I say that for myself. I say that for many of my disabled colleagues. Mark, I hear it in your story as well. And I think, there is just an element of like sitting with the uncomfortable nature of that and just kind of letting it be what it is. And I think along with that, there's just needs to be an acknowledgement that, your work is going to go out into the world and it will do what it will do. And sometimes it's going to reach people. Sometimes it's going to reach a lot of people and sometimes it's not, right? And I think work just kind of goes out into the world. And what you're hoping for as an artist is that it will connect with somebody. And the thing with art out into the world is that sometimes you get to see when it connects with people and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just have to put the work out into the world and trust that, someone somewhere along the line will read it and just sort of feel like, oh, now I don't feel so alone because this person has gone through something that I have also gone through. And so when I was, I mean, even now, right? Like when I put work out into the world, I have something more of a platform now. So it's a bit different for me. But even now, when I put work out into the world, all I want and all I tell myself is this is going to connect with somebody at some point. And I might not know about it, but I'm just going to rest in that knowledge that someone will see this and they will feel less alone because I have read books and read things and been exposed to art and have felt less alone as a result of that. So it's a small thing, and I know it can feel like a small consolation, but it's a small consolation that I have all the time, as opposed to those moments when someone actually does get in touch about my work or my work ends up on a bestseller list. Like that doesn't happen all that often, and really I would much rather have something that I can come back to and be like, nope, someone's going to connect with my work, and I'm going to touch in with that at all points of my day, and that is what helps me go forward and keep going. Um, Lynn, did you want to talk about Fold?
Yeah, so the Festival of Literary Diversity is a literary festival. We're dedicated to uplifting marginalized voices and underrepresented voices across Canada. So that is folks from any kind of community, whether you're BIPOC or queer or disabled, or a mix of some combination of different communities and identities. Our festival this year is running from April 27th to May 4th. The first 4 days are virtual, so you can log in from anywhere in the world. And then the last 4 days are in Brampton, Ontario. So if you are in the Brampton area or you're able to travel to Brampton, we have a lot of really exciting in-person events, and I will drop links to all of that stuff later on as well once we wrap up, in case anyone's interested in attending. Okay, so let's go back to the Q&A. Any advice in finding creative collaborators in writing? Do people do this? For me specifically, illustrators for graphic novels. Even if I were to embark on a novel, I believe I would need support or collaboration to finish. I'd like to prioritize collaborating with other disabled artists.
Can you read the beginning part of that question again, Lynn? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Any advice in finding creative collaborators in writing? I think that's the main point. How to find collaborators, specifically other disabled artists.
Right, right. I think it's really helpful to think about where you are situated. So, to think about it on kind of circles that move outwards, right? So you think about your sort of inner local circle initially, whether there are any sort of like in-person meetups for disabled artists, that sort of thing. If there are not any in-person, then what sort of stuff is available on a virtual level, right? So I'm not I don't work in a visual medium, but when I think about writing, I think about, what sort of writing groups are available for people in Hamilton, which is where I live. Are those virtual? Are they in person? And then I figure out how to go to them. And then from there, start moving outwards, right? Like, so I would go to independent bookstores and then, make friends with the people who own the bookstores. And I would look at the bulletin lists that are usually at different bookstores. They have them online as well, and look at different things that people are doing, different creative community things. So really, it's about trying to figure out what kind of community avenues are available in your particular area, in your particular space. And that's like a in-person area is sort of your local municipality, but then also it expands outwards. So if you're working in a visual medium, if you are looking to collaborate with someone who's an artist, like there are lots of online forums for that sort of stuff to happen. And it's just a matter of sort of starting with where you are and what you know, and then moving out from that slowly but surely. And it's just, looking at different forums, looking at different community groups, and moving from there.
Great. Okay, next question comes from Justin, and they are in the Canada Council for the Arts portal with a new/early career artist profile. They tried to add themselves as a disabled profile, but couldn't. And so they're wondering, can they apply using 2 different profiles? Is that possible?
To be honest, Justin, I'm not sure. I don't know if it's because it's an early career artist profile that you have, because I put a disabled artist profile on my Canada Council profile once I had moved into a literary writer profile. So I don't know if that's what it is. I will send an email to the Deaf and Disability Arts person and then see for you, and then get that information back to you via Lynn.
Great. Okay, next question comes from Emily. What is your biggest advice for someone who isn't published yet but wants to be an author?
Well, if you want to be published, then working towards publication is a very big initial move toward that goal. And that doesn't mean necessarily publishing a novel. It can mean publishing a short story. It can mean publishing a poem or a suite of poems in a journal. So if that is where you'd like to end up, that is sort of the first place that I would recommend. Like, really start reading literary journals or reading online literary magazines and thinking about the work that you are interested in writing, the work that you do write, and where that might fit. It all starts from getting those initial publications in play. And then once you have those initial publications, you are available and able to apply to different granting streams, which then like slowly widens your purview of an artist. And you'll see that all of that kind of has knock-on effects as well, because when you get published in literary journals, or if you apply to contests, a lot of literary journals in Canada run annual contests, which is a great way to start getting your work out there. Even if it isn't ultimately selected for publication, you can still end up on those like long lists or the short lists. And that's a great thing that you can use. Any little bit ahead that you get with publishing in literary journals or getting on contest lists, you can use all of that, right? Once you publish something somewhere or get on a contest list somewhere, you can say in your introductory letter to a publisher or to another literary journal, my name is so-and-so and I have been published in this magazine. My name is so-and-so and I was, my essay placed first in this contest or was longlisted for this contest. All of that stuff adds up. So it's really just taking a sort of long view and thinking about the little steps that you can make going towards it. And you'll find too that with every little step you make, the community that you are building around yourself as a writer starts to widen, because you'll start to recognize the names of other people who are published alongside you. You'll, hear about different events that are happening for writers and maybe decide to go along to some of them or attend them virtually. And all of that will sort of slowly start to take on a life of its own in your own art.
Great. Okay, next question comes from Shan, who has received a Ontario Literary Creation Grant and will be traveling for the project that they're doing with that grant. They will have someone traveling with them to help them with baggage and other travel-related needs. So the question is, does the grant cover the travel costs of their the person that they're bringing with them?
Right. This really depends on how you structured your budget for your grant when you put it in. If you factored travel costs for the person into the grant when you applied for it, you said, "Oh, I'm applying for a literary creations grant. I believe that's the $12,000 one. I have set aside $2,000 of this grant to cover the travel costs of this person who's coming with me." If you applied and you said, $12,000 of this is going to go towards my sort of living expenses as a writer while I'm doing it, what you would then have to do is contact the Arts Council and say, my budget is going to be a bit different because I am getting access support to come with me. The Ontario Arts Council does provide a separate access support stream. So that might be something that you want to think about for future applications, and see if it's possible to apply separately to the Literary Creations Grant for those sort of subsistence costs, and then to the access stream for those specific access related needs. You may very well be able to finagle the grant that you have, but I would recommend that you contact the council and speak to an officer about that and just make sure that everything is okay by them.
Great. Okay, Chris asks, is it possible to apply at the federal and provincial level for the same project?
Yes.
Great. That was easy. Easy one. Okay. What would you say to someone whose disability or treatment can make it hard to write or create art?
I think this goes back to that expectation of what a lot of us in our capitalist world assume a life built around art looks like. If you have a disability where it is hard to create art, it's really about what you are able to do and the moments that you are able to do it. It's not about making sure that you are creating art every single day or, for like a couple of times a week. Like, it's not about quotas. It's about acknowledging that even when you are not creating art as such, you are living in the world as an artist. You are looking at the world in an artistic way. And in that sense, your life becomes your art. I know it sounds a little bit trite, but I think we really need to get away from this idea that being a disabled artist means, at the very least, that you need to be creating art of some kind all the time. That's not the case. Like, I think our lives are in many ways our art and entryways into the art that we do. And so resting in that space of just being like, I will exist in an artistic space always, and what that looks like is going to be different from time to time. Sometimes it will mean that there is output. Sometimes it means that I will write a story, or I will make a painting, or I will create a song, or I will do something. And sometimes it will just mean that I am just existing as my disabled self in the world. And that is enough. It is more than enough.
Okay. Next question is about attending in-person events as a chronically ill writer, especially events that no longer have a masking policy. So in the question, full transparency, the Fold no longer has a required mandatory masking policy. So for someone who is chronically ill, how do you suggest that they go about navigating that to be able to go to in-person things?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is a really tricky question, and I am afraid that I don't have a good answer for it, because I think ultimately we are at a point in society where society doesn't have a good answer for these things anymore. We really had an opportunity during the COVID pandemic to move towards a world that was, and I say during the COVID pandemic as though it's over. Of course, it's not over. It's still around us all the time. We really had an opportunity to move toward a world that looked at things differently. And we unfortunately have tried instead to go back to 2019 before the pandemic started. And that is really tricky, because I think the reality of the matter is that, masking policies are not enforced now the way that they used to be. And that can be really, really disheartening for those of us who are chronically ill, who have chronically ill family members that we have to look after and care for. I think the reality, it's also true that there are many people, many disabled people, who really struggle with wearing masks, right? And so there's that conflicting access needs issue that has always been present around mask wearing. And so it's really hard, because I don't realistically think that it's possible to expect a world where we have a mask enforced policy, where arts institutions have a masks enforced policy anymore. And so what you can do as a chronically ill disabled person is, try and mitigate the risk to yourself by wearing a mask, by encouraging those around you to wear masks, by continuing to have the conversation around how mask wearing can be very beneficial. But also leaving space for the conflicting access that comes up, because some people can't. Yes, some people who can't wear masks can do things like wear face shields. This is why having in-person and online access for things is also really important. The key is to have options available to people so that people can make their own decisions about risk mitigation. And it's really tough, and I just keep coming back to that, because there is no perfect answer here. I think we have to, as disabled and chronically ill people, move through an imperfect world and find our own levels of comfort within that. And that is again where grief becomes a really a constant companion in ways that we all really struggle with. I'm really sorry that is an issue that you are dealing with, and I hope that as disabled writers and artists, we can continue to advocate for mask wearing in spaces, and really just help people to see that it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be a difficult thing. It's meant to be, a community thing to help us think about how we can care for each other, but acknowledging that journey is one that is going to be filled with disappointment on lots of levels is just, I think, something that we have to sit at varying degrees of okayness with, and not even okayness, just like acknowledgement, and then push for better situations when and where we can.
For the Fold, we have a venues page up on our website that talks about the different venues where our events are taking place, and it describes a bit about the size of the venue, how many people we expect to be in that space. So if that helps people make decisions about what they're comfortable with, that information is there as well. Okay, so Yolande says, love to know what you would think about residencies and access needs. So I think the situation is that they had applied to a residency and had been asked about their access needs, which then they communicated, and then that organization did not accommodate them. And so the question is, how do they communicate with organizations who feel like they don't have the resources, financial or otherwise, to accommodate?
Again, a tricky question. I think, so much of what we talk about here is so hard to navigate because we are dealing with structural systemic issues, which we as individuals do not have the power to fix. And really all we can do as disabled people is to really sort of dig into this idea and reality of awareness, of increasing awareness around accessibility needs. I mean, all of the work that we are doing around raising awareness of disability in the world, around raising awareness of access needs, and helping people to understand that, these are things that organizations have a responsibility to give. It's stuff that, I'm not happen for us in our lifetimes, but hopefully will happen for people along the way. All I can say is that I'm sorry that happened to you, Yolande. And I hope that in your response to them, you were able just to outline that, like, this is really important, and this is something that you need to think about doing in the future. I think the arts world is populated with people who really mean well and are really trying to build an inclusive space, but they're doing so with a huge lack of resources. And so understanding how people operate in that space and being both compassionate towards them, but also rigorous, like not letting people off the hook, right? This is a responsibility that you have to provide for people who have access needs. I understand that you're maybe not in a position where you could do it right now, but I really think that you need to think about how you can do this in the future. What resources can you tap into? What funding can you apply for that will give you and put you in a better position in the future to meet these access needs for somebody else, right? So learning how to operate in that space of compassion, but also rigor in our responses to people is really, really important.
Okay, Jane asks, how does energy fit into your framework? So you had finances, time, community, creative space, and underlying all of that is energy, which is a difficulty for Jane. And so how do you fit energy into that?
Yeah. So energy is a thing that kind of underpins all four of those resources for me. Garnering financial resources is about getting myself time that I can focus on art where I don't have to think about other things, because thinking about other things while focusing on my art depletes my energy. Making sure that I have time to focus solely on my art is great, because focusing on my art while having to do all kinds of other things also depletes my energy. Community is a really big thing for me because it costs energy for me to go out and be social with people. So I know that when I am engaging in community elements, I am using energy that I will not be able to give to other things. So it's always a tricky balance. And so I think for me, when I was talking about those four resources, the creative space one, the fourth one, is really about allowing that energy to get to a space where I feel like I am using it and it is flourishing. And obviously, this is arbitrary. Like, four resources, this is just me in my own life. This is not meant to be a hard and fast rule that everybody needs to follow. You may very well find that energy plays like a more prominent role, so that you have 5 resources, or you have 4 resources and one of them is energy as opposed to creative space. It's really about figuring out how you can have a framework in your own life where you are using all of these things to shore up your sense of your creative self and giving yourself the space to have energy and to replenish your energy as needed.
Great. Okay, Jen, it's not a question, but she just wants to say that a 38-year-old with CP also has been struggling with fatigue and frustrated that there's very little information out there for adults with CP. So Jen just wants to thank you for saying out loud that prioritizing rest is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is, Jen. I hope that that can continue to be a priority for you as well. And fingers crossed that, you know, the world will change and that we'll have some resources about being adults with cerebral palsy at some point in the future.
Yeah. Okay. So Lenny says, how do you deal with anxiety about letting go of work that makes you money in order to create more time to write?
Yeah, so maybe a year or so ago, I heard someone say, and it really was quite revolutionary for me, the antidote to anxiety is not control, it is trust. And I know that that sounds like a strange thing to say. It sounds almost kind of like woo woo and out there. But it has been really, really important for me. I am someone who has, you know, I have struggled with anxiety at various points in my life. Like it really kind of peaks and flows, ebbs and flows as well. And that has been really, really important and key for me in dealing with my own anxiety is to trust that something will come up. And, you know, something, I make it as wide as possible. So like, you know, when I think about my own life and how my financial resources will be gone as of the end of the year, I keep telling myself something will come up. And if I was only saying something will come up and that something is going to be a book deal that's going to make me a lot of money, when that doesn't happen, and it's probably not going to happen, I am very disappointed. But when I say something will come up, and that something could mean anything from moving back in with my parents to getting a part-time job, to moving somewhere for a residency, to becoming a dog walker, to going back to my job that I had at the hospital before I worked at the Fold. Like all of these things are in play for me. And I am trusting that I will be able to look at an opportunity when it comes. And even if it's not like my first choice, I will be able to say, okay, I need to take care of my financial resources at this point in time. So that is what I'm going to do. And that has been really, really, again, just it's been really revolutionary for me. And I think really what it comes down to is you know, not, I am trusting in the universe in a very woo-woo kind of way, but actually I am trusting in myself. I am trusting that I have at this point in time built up enough resources, enough contacts, enough community that I can exist in that space. I can ask for help when I need to. And like it has taken me a really long time to get to this point. Like I have been working in this field for 25 years now in order to be in this space where I feel like I can exist for a little while in a freelance capacity. And like I have said, that may very well change by the end of this year. But trusting as much as possible has been really, really helpful for me in managing that anxiety.
Right. Yolande mentions that the Writers Union of Canada offers health insurance for writers, although it is an extra cost on top of the membership fee for the Writers Union of Canada. So if that's something people are interested in looking into, I'm sure there's information on their website about that. Megan asks that they would love to attend the Banff writing residency, but the costs are prohibitive. Are there any grants that are specific for attending writing residencies?
So there is a travel grant available through the Canada Council. When I went to Banff in 2016, I applied for a travel grant that covered partial costs. So they covered the airfare and they covered, what else was it? Covered the airfare and I flew into Calgary and then there was the cost of traveling from Calgary to Banff. So they covered that. I mean, I did take 2 weeks away from work or whatever it was. So like the grant didn't cover that portion of things, but it did cover the travel costs, which were great. Also, I was able to use, like I could claim the retreat on my taxes as like an educational thing as a writer. So there is that element of it as well.
Great. Okay, so Eva asks that you have mentioned fatigue in your presentation. Are there some coping strategies for managing fatigue and brain fog within the writing process?
Within the writing process, I say that only because I feel like brain fog is like a regular occurrence for me within the writing process. I know it's different from the brain fog that you mentioned, but I just feel like as a writer, I exist with it all the time until the book is actually published. Um, I again, and I know that this is different for everybody, but I really just give myself space to rest when I need to. And if I am working on something and struggling, or if I am working on something and I'm getting a headache, I don't push through, I don't finish the project. I let the project go, and I know that I can always come back to it afterwards. So prioritizing how I feel and giving myself that space has been really, really important for me. And if it means that, it takes me twice as long to finish a project, then it takes me twice as long to finish a project. And that again is where having those other resources in play and in place in varying degrees can be really helpful. If I have a day job and I can go back to just focusing on the day job for a while because writing just takes up too much space, or I'm getting too much brain fog around it, then that can be seen in some ways. For me, I see it as rest from the creative work, which is also important, right, and essential in order to have a good creative life.
Mm-hmm. All right, this next question comes from Megan. It sounds like it's coming from like an event organizer, event planner angle. How do we make sure, or what steps can we take to make our events more accessible? And I guess specifically for like the GTA area, is there a list of spaces that are accommodating for accessibility?
Mm. There used to be an online resource that talked about accessible spaces in Toronto. I don't remember the name of it. Whenever I tried to reference it, I would usually just Google accessible venues in Toronto and it would come up. I'm not sure if it's still being kept up to date. I don't know, Lynn, you'll have to look into this. I did an event, or I did a webinar for the Fold a couple of years ago about hosting accessible events as an event organizer. So that might be something that that everyone at the Fold, sorry, I still think of you guys as we.
Who are we? You're never going to leave us.
Yeah, you might want to think about putting that up on YouTube again. I'd be happy to have that available as a resource for everyone. I mean, I don't want to go into it now because it would be a whole other presentation in and of itself. But I think broadly, when you're thinking about hosting an accessible event, you want to think about access in terms of getting into the space, and then also in terms of the information that you're putting out. So having an event in a wheelchair accessible space is great, but if some people come to your event and they are deaf and they can't actually access the content, even though they can get in the door, that becomes a problem, right? So another way that you want to think about access is through economic access as well. Having an event where the tickets are $25 is not accessible for a lot of people. So it's about thinking about access on a multitude of different levels, and building your event out from there.
Okay, Rebecca asks, what are the joys of getting your stories out there? Sorry. What joys do you have in getting your stories out there? Is it connection to readers or something else?
It really is connection to readers. I mean, that is what it comes down to. There is absolutely a pride, and especially when the book is out and you see this thing that has existed in your head for so long suddenly out there in the world as a physical object. Also, Penguin Random House did a really wonderful job. I have deckled edges on this book, which is just so great, and it's just like it's a nice thing to hold. And anyway, it is really about connection with readers for me, like getting emails from people who read my work and see themselves in it in some way, or even emails from people who read my work and then think or say like, it made them see the world differently is huge. And that can happen. It's like I was talking about earlier, right? That making the decision to focus on these little things that can happen in your day all the time. Like I still get emails from people who read Disfigured 5 years ago. Or read Disfigured Now, this book that was published 5 years ago, and it's still impacting them in some way. So I really, really hang on to those moments.
Okay, let's go do a verbal question from Mark.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, because you said the like you've said it a couple times, but I can't catch if I'm missing a word. You mentioned like the Ontario Arts Council, and then what was the other one?
The Canada Council for the Arts.
For the arts. I knew there was something missing there. And I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of your writing and stuff, um, have you thought of like getting out there in self-promotion in terms of like YouTube channels? And you mentioned the podcast. Are you launching a podcast? And finally, have you heard of, I could screw up the name, but I'll look for the link, Creative Connector, which is all free for crip artists of all sorts, from musicians to writers to seamstress to, because I wanted to let you know about that if you didn't, because it's another way to network if you wanted to. And like, have you thought of branching out in your creative space, like screenplay writing, let's say? And finally, for anybody that doesn't know, can you give a synopsis of your or a summary of your newest book? I would be one of the ones that doesn't know.
Sure, sure. Thank you for those questions, Mark. In terms of Creative Connector, I was not aware of that as a resource. So please, if you can, put it in the chat for everybody to be aware of it. I think that's great. I do think about branching out into other projects. I am working with a screenwriter now about maybe looking at adapting some of my work into screenplays. And I am thinking about a podcast, but all of that is dependent on funding. So it's something that I know that I do not have the space and the energy to do if I don't have the funding for it. So it's not a project that I will embark on unless I actually do get funding to do it. And that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of making those kinds of creative decisions, right? Like some people can just go ahead and embark on something and, you know, think that maybe the funding will come through. And if it doesn't, they'll just power through. I am not one of those people. Like I need to make sure that I'm taking care of my energy at all times. But you know, I do think about different projects, and I think that's part of having a creative life and being an artist is thinking about the ways in which your work can shift and change, and dabbling in different art forms is always part of the fun. And in terms of a synopsis for Wildlife, Wildlife is a novel in short stories. So each chapter deals with a different person, and each of those people interact with two of the main characters in the novel, who are a pair of married hyenas who walk and talk. So they are animals that walk and talk. And they're sort of like these mythical, godlike, but not figures who kind of move through the book over the course of a number of decades. And they sort of bring a message of liberation and grief and working with grief to people that they interact with. It's a very strange novel, but it's definitely the novel that I've had most fun writing.
It's very good. Everyone should go read it. So yes. Okay, so Sarah asks, what if you have family members who offer financial support and you are dependent upon them for those finances? Can you talk a bit about the emotional effects of being dependent upon someone else for finances or being able to accept that kind of support?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that. I mean, it's always tricky, right? Because again, in our capitalistic, individualistic culture, we are raised to believe that we are individuals first and foremost, and we should all be working towards a world in which we are not dependent on anybody else. We are doing everything for ourselves. And I think that's a really flawed kind of way to look at it. The reality is that we are completely interdependent as human beings. Like I rely on the community around me, not even just my disabled community or my family, but like the community around me that like builds my roads and keeps the grocery store open so that I can go and get food. Like I am reliant on all of these people, right? We are all of us stitched into the fabric of a society where we depend on one another for our well-being. And I think, you know, it would be to our benefit as a society if we really accepted this and celebrated it for what it is. I don't know the specifics of your situation, so you know, I obviously can't speak to that as much, but I think if you are in a position where, you know, family is helping you financially and there isn't resentment on either level, on either side rather, for that. Like that's something to think about in terms of going back to those 4 resources, right? Like that can be a financial resource, right? I have a family member who lives at home with my parents, and they struggle a lot with living at home and feeling like it's a failure. But what I always try and talk to them about and sit and get them to see is that like this is actually access to a resource, right? Like you don't have to worry about certain things like your housing or your food, because it is taken care of for you in this way, and it allows you space to think about other things and to focus on other things, at least at this point in time. Your situation might change in the future, but right now, think about it as a way in which you have a resource that is being met. And so that hopefully can be helpful. Like, again, it could change. And there maybe are difficult feelings to work through where that is a part of the whole process. But the reality of the matter is that, certainly at this point, it is a resource that is being met in a particular way. And it's about trying to shift your mindset so that, not so that, you need to be grateful for it or anything like that, but just understanding that like, okay, at this point in time, this is a resource that is being met, which allows me space to do other things in other particular ways. I hope that framing can be helpful.
Great. Kent asks, can you talk about motivation? How do you find the motivation to write, methods that you use to spark creative motivation?
Mm. I remember reading years ago that it was Margaret Atwood who talked about the writer as a magpie. You sort of look for things that are shiny, and then you take that shiny thing and you just sort of take it away to your nest, and you wait for a moment when that shiny thing becomes a part of the art that you're doing. And that has been really, really helpful for me, going through and just noticing the world. And when I was talking earlier about the kind of artistic lives that we lead, where we're open to wonder all the time, that is really a key part of it, is just noticing the world and being really interested in it. Last year in the spring, I remember taking my dog on a walk, and we looked up and saw, and it was a nest in a tree high up, and it was a huge nest. And I thought at first, because my glasses prescription needs to be changed, I thought that it was actually like a coat that had either been tossed up into the tree, or this is where my mind went, maybe a bird saw a discarded jacket and they carried it up into the tree to build their home. And I'm not really a poet, but for some reason a poem came out of this encounter, and it was just about seeing. It was just about noticing. And being able to just notice things without any expectation for what that noticing is going to lead to. Like I don't go out into the world and say, okay, I'm going to look at that tree and that tree is going to transform into a novel for me. I am just going on my walk with my dog, and I notice a leaf, or I notice a discarded glove on the sidewalk, or I notice the way that a dog looks at its owner, or things like that. And then I just file it away. And then I trust, again, there's that trust part of it, that will come up again for me at some point in the future. And when I was initially starting out as an artist, it was a little bit difficult to, I felt like my store of things, my bank of things was really small. But the more that I did that, the more things I had in the bank that I could refer to and rely on when I wanted to write about something. But then also it changed the way that I looked at the world. Like instead of going out and thinking I'm only going to look at things that are really, really interesting and worthy, everything became worthy of interest. The angle of a building against the sky, or the way that someone in a worker that I'm walking past, the way that he shouts to his comrade, like all of those things become usable and workable. So I guess it's like ramping up that magpie energy, really, like thinking about the world as just full of shiny things that you can take away and store for when the time comes to build them into something else.
Okay. Lots of people are just sending in like feedback saying that they really enjoyed the presentation and how much it's resonated. So I'm gonna just skip over some of those since
I know we are getting late, and I'm just
yeah.
like poor Lynn.
That's okay. Any advice? So there are a few people who have asked this. The process of applying for grants can itself be quite arduous. So any advice for people who struggle with that, either because they have a disability that makes it difficult for them to understand how to do it or to do it, or, you know, it just takes so much time for them, or maybe they have some sort of disability flare up, which means that they won't be able to meet the deadline. So how do they navigate the actual application process as a person with disability?
Yeah, so there is application assistance available for these kinds of things. And I know this timelines can be tricky with disabilities because, you know, we never really know what our energy levels are going to be at a certain point in time. But I would encourage, where possible, for people to try and think a little bit farther out if you are able to. So for example, if you know that a deadline for a grant is going to be in the fall, you know, start thinking about application assistance and all of that and researching that in the spring. If not even sooner than that, like giving yourself lots of lead time and then looking at what that application assistance, what they cover, what, you know, is available to you as an artist, what kind of application assistance you might need. Like maybe you need someone to, you know, go through and outline the application in plain language. Maybe you need someone who will actually go into the portal, sit beside you, go into the portal with you and fill out the application. Like that kind of stuff can be covered. You can get financial assistance for that. So I would recommend looking at that. And then building in, where possible, contingencies. So like if you aren't able to meet the deadline for one particular grant, like thinking about, okay, I didn't get this one, but maybe I'll get the next one. Maybe I can fine tune the application and have it ready ahead of time. It is an ongoing conversation. I will say both the Canada Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council, like, you know, they're continually thinking about ways in which the granting portals, the grant processes themselves can be made easier. The Saskatchewan Arts Board, the event grants, those kinds of things. Like I have been in talks with them about how they need to change their granting processes, both to think about disability as event organizers, but also to make the applications themselves easier. It's an ongoing, evolving thing. So given that, and given that this ongoing evolution means that it's probably, you know, not a situation where it's going to meet the needs of everybody at a given time. It's just like, look for what access supports they have, make use of those access supports to the best of your abilities, and then try thinking about, you know, the long game of grants, like trying to plan a little bit ahead of time. And I know that's difficult as disabled people. I wish it was easier. I wish that, you know, it could just be like a pot of money that was just given out to people. But unfortunately, that is not how grants work. And as with most things in our disabled lives, we have to learn how to be creative and adaptable to the structures that are in place. Again, disabled grief, it comes up everywhere.
Yes. So there are, okay. I see that Megan has a verbal question. I'm just going to let you ask that as I sort through some more questions. Go ahead.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for doing this. It's great to see representation in the, you know, community for disabled authors. I guess my question is a little bit complex, but it's around kind of discrimination, and as somebody who is out publicly online, who's trying to be out more within the literary community as somebody who is disabled. I have an invisible disability, although when I use my mobility, it's less invisible. But my question is, how do you kind of combat that discrimination and stay hopeful and vulnerable? Like you do such a beautiful job of that. So I just wanted tactics and advice.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that, Megan. I mean, the reality, of course, is that, again, I do have a lot of privilege as a disabled person. And that has played into it a lot, right? And I'm in a position now where I can use my privilege in particular ways. So like refusing, as I mentioned earlier, refusing to do events that are not, at the very least, held in physically accessible spaces is like a bedrock of things for me. That's one of the ways in which I use my privilege to sort of combat that discrimination and really get people to operate in that space of understanding that the world looks different for everybody, right? I think it's also true that like so I've been doing this work in disability activism in literary spaces in particular for the better part of the last sort of 5-6 years. And there was a real period kind of in the middle where I got really, really angry and I was really frustrated because even amongst my allies, people who I love and people who I know are doing really good work, they were, consistently not doing things that were accessible. Instagram is one of my favorite examples to cite, right? Sometimes people use alt text. Sometimes they put alt text in their descriptions of their captions. And a lot of times people don't. And they don't because it's either a thing that people don't think about or it's just a thing that they don't have time for. And they think, oh, it's just Instagram. I'll just slap up a photo and it doesn't matter, right? And I had to get to a point where I really had to adjust my expectations for the kind of beautiful, accessible world that I thought we were all going to be in. And that was a difficult process for me, but what helped was scaling down my expectations of myself. So scaling down the kind of life that I thought I was going to have in the literary community, scaling down the expectations for the influence that I thought I was going to have in the community. Like I am no longer out there thinking that I am going to change the world as a disabled person. I am out here thinking I am going to change, to the best of my ability, the little spaces that I operate in, right? So when I go to an event, I am going to try and change the space of that event by doing things like not participating if it's not physically accessible. And all the rest of it, the discrimination that comes against disabled people in other areas, like I am going to sit with that and rage with that, but then I am going to let it move through me and let it go and acknowledge that these are the small victories that I am not going to see in my life because I am going to be able to see victories in other areas and other ways. So really it's about understanding how you as a disabled person get comfortable in your own reality and then moving that comfort outwards, right? Like doing what you can to change what you can and then trying to not be comfortable, but trying to be at peace, a sort of reluctant peace with the changes that you can't make or the things that you are not in control of, because we are not in control of a whole heck of a lot.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you for that. There are a lot of questions around like, do you know of a resource for this thing or for that thing? And I think that it might be best if I can do a little bit of Googling in the background and then send out resources through the email because these are quite specific questions. One question I think that is applicable to everyone is any tricks for countering feelings of imposter syndrome?
Yeah. This is a great question. And it's one that's close to my heart because part of my disability journey, even though, as I've said, I've been disabled my whole entire life, I walked with a limp since I was 4 years old. I was bullied really severely when I was in school as a result of my limp. And I, for a long part of my life, tried to pretend that I wasn't disabled because disability was synonymous with me with feeling less than, with being treated as though I was less than. So there was all this emotional work that had to happen around acknowledging and accepting my disability. And I think what I really lean into now is the idea and the reality that disability is not an either or thing, like it is a spectrum. And it runs from like being someone who wears eyeglasses to, someone who has very, very severe challenges in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Like there are a lot of disabilities that we see out there in the world that are, as Megan noted, like quote unquote invisible, right? But they impact people's lives in very real, very particular ways. Disability for me is synonymous with saying I have a particular need and that need deserves to be met. And when we shift that awareness, it makes the whole world operate in a different way. Because right now we operate in a world where society has determined that some needs are worthy of being met by society, and some needs are not worthy of being met by society. And with some needs, you are SOL, you are up a creek, alone without a paddle sort of thing. You have to figure it out on your own. And I really, it has been key for me understanding my own disability to be like, nope, I also deserve to be here, even though I have a lot of able-bodied privilege within the disability that I do have. I deserve to be here because there are things that I experience as a disabled person, the bullying, the fatigue, the isolation, the sadness, the grief. All of these things are things that other disabled people experience, even though their disabilities are different from mine. So whenever I have moments of feeling like, oh, well, you're not really a disabled person, you can't speak to the experience the way that other people can, that is what I come back to. No, I do deserve to be here because there are elements of my experience that everybody else can connect with, just as there are elements of other disabled people's experiences that I can connect with, even though they're different in my own life. So when imposter syndrome comes up for you, just remember, no, you deserve to be here. We all deserve to be here. We all have needs that deserve to be met. Full stop.
Sorry, just trying to answer a question through typing. All right. I think that I'm going to stay on for a little bit longer so I can answer some of these questions through just typing. But I think that covers most of the questions. Sorry, there's sirens going on in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. But let me just do a little bit of wrap up here. Our next Fold Academy is going to be on April 19th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Kate Gies is our writer in residence for 2025, and she's going to be talking about how to find your author voice. So how do you craft a voice that sounds uniquely you? Registration for that is open now, so you can go to thefoldacademy.org/academy. Sorry, thefoldcanada.org/academy to find out more about that. Like I mentioned, our Festival of Literary Diversity runs from April 27th to May 4th. April 27th to the 30th is virtual, so we have events that are crafted specifically for a virtual experience. And then from May 1st to 4th, we have in-person events that are crafted specifically for an in-person experience. So there was someone asking whether they could switch from one festival to the other. And it doesn't really work that way because it's not like a duplication of the same kinds of events. Every event is unique on its own, whether it's in-person or virtual. So many people actually go to both the in-person and virtual events because we talk about different things. Registration for that is also open. You can go to thefoldcanada.org/register to learn more about the events. We have the full schedule available so you can see which events you might be interested in attending. And again, tickets and registration are available now. We have a really exciting new venture, Fold Apparel. It's a clothing line that we've created that features some of the most popular designs from previous years. So you can see here, there's the Fold Varsity logo. We've got slogans like bookmarks are for quitters, the read line. So if you go to thefoldcanada.org and on the upper right-hand corner of the website, there's a shop button. You can go there and check out all of the different things that are available. If there's something that piques your fancy, we would love to spread out all the Fold apparel as far and as wide as we can make it go. We have a quick survey. It should only take about 3 minutes or so to complete. I'm going to throw it into the chat here. This helps us understand what is working, what is not working, whether you have suggestions for future Fold Academy webinars, any specific speakers that you would like us to look into inviting. So if you have a few minutes, we would love for your feedback on how we're doing. And then lastly, the Fold Academy workshops are all free of charge, and we believe strongly in keeping it free for all writers and aspiring authors. In order to do that, we depend upon the generosity of our supporters. So if you have found value in our monthly workshops, please consider supporting us with a monthly donation or a one-time donation. Every little bit counts. You can go to thefoldcanada.org/donate to learn about the various donation options. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Like I said, I'm gonna stick around for a couple extra minutes to answer a few extra questions. But other than that, thanks so much, and we can see you next month for our next Fold Academy.